Welcome, my children, to a world of tiny models. Tiny models I've painted in the last 2 months and are usually seen rotating serenely for your pleasure. Here we have something for my Seraph, a Slan Starmaster, which was a Christmas present from Seamus, so thanks very much, man. This is one of those models that was cast in metal before and now is cast in resin, meaning that it's a bit rough in places, and despite having a defined hole for the flight stand, it's not straight, so getting it to sit right on the stand is a bit of a nightmare. But still, it was a lot of fun to paint a very grumpy looking frog. He's legit great, I love him. Actually, here's a nice thing I noticed about Seraph whilst doing this. Because they consist of so many different species, you do get to play around with many different skin tones and textures, which just keeps things varied and stops you getting bored of painting the exact same thing. So, that's cool. If you're wondering what these specks sitting on a biscuit are, they're Skinners from Troublemaker Games. They're part of the Defeat in Detail range and can be bought from Vanguard Miniatures. The fact they look remarkably like epic scale orcs when painted green is entirely coincidental, I'm sure. Although it should be mentioned that unlike the 6mm epic scale, these are much smaller, they're 3mm. I thought it'd be fun to try and make a sort of mini diorama out of them, so I used some cork to create the raised area at the back and cut apart the rows a little so they'd sit more naturally. How were they to paint? Well, as you would imagine, quite fiddly. You really have to think very basic when doing something this small, breaking them down into big chunks of colour and thinking about the overall effect rather than worrying about each individual orc. Went with a Death Skulls theme, largely because I'd never actually painted any before. I'm pretty proud of the banner and the fact that I managed to do their individual teeth, although for that I can thank the clear definition on the sculpts. They're truly remarkable for how small they are. These are also a nightmare to try and focus on and photograph, so apologies if I'm not able to get the best footage of them. Oh, and for mini totals purposes, these all count as one bought and painted, since although I do have a stack of them left, they seem to be intended to all go on the same base, and when you're dealing with stuff like this, it seems the only sensible way to go. Also from Seamus are some ships from GW's old nautical game, Man O' War. He sent us the old box set for a future video, so I've been restoring the ships and their very fiddly masts to their former glory. These are the first 3 war galleys, the box contains 12 of them, 6 for the Empire and 6 Pirate. Painted up nice and simply with custom sails and flags I knocked up from the original templates in Photoshop. I might replace those with something fancier at some point, but for now the checks and fish combo works well enough. The next 3 are mostly done too, so you'll probably see those show up in the next log. They'll look basically identical to these, but will have a slightly different flag. Oh, and as you will have probably grown to expect by now, I painted some grots too. These were the ones I had left over from the Shadow Sword build, and I used a few parts from that to modify these because, you know, that's just what I do. You've seen me paint over 70 of these by now, so there's nothing really new to say here. But, speaking of the Shadow Sword, okay, here's the big one to end the episode with. This hefty boy took up all of my painting time for like a month. This is my Rebel Grot Shadow Sword. Yes, I know they can't technically use them, we'll get to that in a moment. As you can see, the basic layout of the thing is mostly unchanged, but with lots of small alterations that vary in complexity, from simple things like covering up or removing Imperial iconography, all the way up to building a crow's nest. My original plans for it were far more elaborate, but once I got my hands on the kit and started to plan out how I was going to actually do the thing, pretty much every original idea I had was thrown out except for one, the tiny mushroom garden at the back here. Hey, a revolution is hungry work. I went with a Shadow Sword over any of the other builds here because A, I just really like how they look, and B, it has the biggest gun, and just because they're not orcs doesn't mean they're not greenskins. This thing is also full of magnets, which serve 2 purposes. One is simply for transport, since several parts of this, like the crow's nest or this communications array, would shatter into a million pieces the moment it was transported, so I made sure that they were removable. The other reason is that unless I'm playing open play, or maybe that I end up building a tank company of grots, I won't be running this as a Shadow Sword, unless of course my match play opponent is feeling nice and doesn't mind me bending the rules a little. For all other times, the sponsons can pop off, the bloke on top gets replaced with a turret, and voila! It can now be run as a kill tank. And if I want to run it as the other kill tank variant, well, I have that too. The whole top pops off as well so that I can store some of the extra parts in there for simplicity. Also, and this was entirely unintentional, but the fact that this grot comes off to make room for a turret means that when the grot in the stolen tank commander hat is present, it's using Imperial rules, and when it's not, it's using Orc rules, which is a neat way of symbolising that I completely stumbled into. This has been by far the biggest and most complicated model I've built and painted. I know it doesn't look like the most elaborate looted super heavy in the world, but some parts on this, like creating the little rooms for grots to be poking out of, or building all the sturdy supports inside for magnetization, were pretty complex for me, and it took a lot of dry fitting and trial and error. Overall, I'm really happy with the final product, although there are a few touch-ups I may do as time goes on, both to the build and to its paint job. But for now, I'll take a little bit of a break and paint some slightly smaller models for a bit. Oh, and for those wondering what the glyphs on the barrel say, they mean MOD. You see, because my grots have seized the means of destruction. I think it's funny anyway. So there we go, another 10 minis in the bag, including the biggest one I've ever done. This brings my totals up to 23 models painted in 2021 against 14 models bought. And yeah, although the painted number is currently a smidge lower than I'd like to be at this point in the year, I'm sure I'll catch up with my relatively small goal of 1 mini a week soon. After all the models I plan to paint after this point are going to be somewhat less work than, you know, a super heavy. Still, I'm happy with my progress, as should you all looking at the models you've been painting. I do love seeing the wide range of things, both GW and non-GW alike. Basically, every time I do this, the only reason I don't immediately order a bunch of models that I see here is the fact that I have to pay rent, which I think is reason enough to abolish landlords personally. Anyway, I hope you all had a lovely Pride Month, and I'll see you here next time.